Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, myself and Jack are going to be going over the best and most interesting cards of Paldea Evolved. This is of course a massive set, not just based on the cards that we're actually talking about, but also because it is going to be the set released just before the NAIC, the largest scale tournament in the year, as well as the World Championships, which is the most important tournament of the year. So it's going to be very influential to get a good grip of the Paldea Evolved expansion so that we can do the best in those tournaments. So let's get into it.
Yep, and as per usual, we have the OmniPoke rating system. Just feel free to pause here if you want to know exactly how we're breaking down these cards. Remember, this is for the standard format only, just looking at the Paldea Evolved meta, so not sort of looking with any kind of any more future than that, just exactly what's going to be in this meta. And as usual, we've also got the community ratings as well. We had over 300 responses, which is, I think, one of the highest we've ever had. So thanks so much to everyone who responded. It's always really interesting to see your takes, and I think it adds a nice little unique aspect to each of these slides, so thanks so much once again. And yeah, as always, we're going to kick things off with the trainers, and what a brilliant one to start off with. Look at that pie chart. We're going to be starting off with Aiono, which I think is undeniably the best card in the set, one of the best cards that's been printed in years. I think it's been people have been crying for a card like this for so long, and we're finally getting some kind of N sort of spiritual successor. It's a real combination between N and Marnie. It's a supporter card that says each player shuffles their hands and put it to the bottom of their deck. Then each player draws a card for each of their remaining prize cards. So yeah, it's got the first effect of N, but sort of the second effect of Marnie, where you're sorry, the first effect of Marnie, but the second effect of N. So you're, basically you're able to use it in the early turns to help you set up. It's still going to be a draw 5, draw 6 a lot of the time, but in the late game, when your opponent's taken a load of prizes, you're actually going to be able to disrupt them, similarly to how Roxanne does, but in a much less limiting factor, because you're actually able to use this as a draw supporter for yourself early game, but still have that sort of disruption aspect later on, which is just going to be brilliant, to be honest. I think it's been undeniable the amount of people that have wanted some kind of card like this for years, to be honest. Marnie never really, to be honest, hit the spot. It was more disruptive and more annoying than anything, because it could be used as early as turn 1, that really just closed out games in not a very nice feeling way. This is actually a really, really good card in terms of, is like a feels nice card. You're able to try and get that set up whilst not having to dedicate sort of potentially dead spaces to things like Roxanne, that don't necessarily help you get set up in the early turns, but can still be useful to disrupt in the late game. This is brilliant for formats that like to be a little bit slower and like to evolve as well. So really fits well into some very strong archetypes right now. I think one of the biggest ones is Gardevoir. Gardevoir with 4 Aiono has seen a huge amount of success in Japan, and I think there's going to be no denying how strong it's going to be over here as well. Gardevoir is already a very, very solid deck, and having this kind of draw supporter as well as inbuilt disruption is just going to be brilliant for it, especially with the kind of deck that Guardi is, that has no real ceiling towards the late game, when you're down to a really thin deck and you're able to just basically power through whatever your opponent has in front of you, trying to disrupt them and just close out the game with this, plus a couple of other cool tools that it grabs from this set as well. Is going to be really, really impressive. Obviously, there's ways we're going to have to sort of move into thinking about how can my deck protect itself from Aiono, and there's plenty of ways to keep that in mind. Things like the barrel that's already seeing play, Curlier, and gift energy in some of these Lugia decks. Maybe that starts seeing a bit more play in other decks as well. So keeping that in mind, decks are maybe going to have to start looking at other on-board draw options. Also, there's the way the format sort of shapes around this card, because this is a completely meta warping card. We may start to see more popular Lost Zone variants like Kyogre, or it's already one of the most popular variants right now, seeing great success. But realistically, if you're able to not take a load of prizes and do the whole Kyogre thing where you end up taking 3, 4, 5, sometimes even 6 prizes all in a turn against a couple of VMAXs, you can actually protect yourself from Aiono for the whole game, which is really, really nice. So definitely some positive points there, considering that Aiono can be a real disruption tool against lost boxes. It's kind of like that judge effect that we see Arceus decks, Lugia decks, and even sort of Gardevoir decks employing to disrupt the Lost Zone matchups. Aiono does that very, very similarly. So Lost Zone could be taking a bit of a hit just naturally in their consistency. So Kyogre looks to be a nice Lost Zone variant that isn't quite hurt as badly. And similarly, we can also look towards other onboard options like onboard acceleration. Things like Archeops and Arceus aren't really affected too much by Aiono because obviously they are naturally, one, going to be thinning the deck out of dead cards to draw, but two, don't really mind too much about what's in the hand because they're just accelerating to the board anyway. So we are really going to have to look at the way decks are built post Iono's release. But overall, this card is absolutely fantastic. It's a brilliant setup card that also helps disrupt in the late game. It really adds a completely new level of skill into the game, like a whole new layer of sort of when to Aiono and how to prize map to sort of play around getting Ionoed and stuff. With Roxanne, it's kind of linear. Do you go past that 3 threshold or not? But now you can really sort of play around with maybe taking smaller amounts of prizes and leaving bigger targets for later on, just to protect yourself from Iono the same way that we've seen N in the past. So yeah, fantastic card. I think we could talk about this card for hours, to be honest. It's a brilliantly designed card, and it really, really does breathe some life into the format. I'm really looking forward to see how it affects all of these decks going forward.
Next up, we have Giacomo. It's a porter card that discards a special energy from each of your opponent's Pokemon. Really reminds me of a Cry of Destruction style effect that we have seen from Yveltal in the past, and I do think this could be a very powerful option, trying to be disruptive against Lugia players as well as Mew players, especially because there is some expectation of Fusion Mew to be quite popular next set. You can sometimes be getting multiple procs from one use of a Giacomo. This obviously straight away leads to players thinking about controlling style archetypes, and there could be big upsides, even though we have Yveltal in format, to like have other Pokemon in the active position doing other like weird attacks or blocking effects, and having this supporter as an option to remove resources from opponents. And we are still expecting Mew to be a factor, we're still expecting Lugia to be a factor, so this is a new sort of tech inclusion style card that can cause some trouble and some headache for these sorts of decks. Not going to give it a super high rating because it's not going to be one of these cards that just fits into all sorts of things. It's going to find its niche, and that's really where it's going to see any play.
Next up, onto some slightly weaker supporters. Clavel is the first one. Search your deck for up to 3 basic Pokemon with 120 HP or less. Reveal them and put them into your hand, then shuffle your deck. So this is very similar to things like Gloria from the past. And realistically, we just have way better options right now in the form of items. We have Nest Ball, we have VIP Pass, and we even have a new stadium called Artisan that we'll talk about momentarily. That all of these serve as not quite as powerful effects as Clavel, but also they're not your support of the turn, so you're still able to use a Research or an Aiono or anything like that. So limited by the fact that we have a pretty strong set of cards that help you search out for your basics in the early turns right now. That combined with, as always, the turn 1 supporter rule, meaning that you can't really play this going first, so it's pretty dead in a lot of games anyway. It means that we're just not going to have any space in our format for a card like this.
Onto Dendra. It puts a card from your hand to the bottom of your deck, then draw until you have 5 cards in hand. And you can't play this if you have no other cards in hand. So we actually already have upgrades to this, essentially. Putting cards to the bottom of your deck and then drawing is typically worse than shuffling. The only real upside is you get to keep maybe like a rare candy piece or something in hand and try and dig for the other part of the combo. It's not going to be all that relevant, though. I think this is outclassed even by Serena, which does a very similar effect in sort of discarding cards and then drawing up to 5. And that's kind of the worst side of Serena. There's also other upside in that it could also be an additional Gust card in your deck. So quite weak compared to other things that are already in the format. So no real reason to play Dendra.
Faulkner says draw 2 cards. If you have a stadium card in play, draw 2 more cards. Realistically, we have plenty of great draw options right now, and even the decks that want to play multiple stadiums like Path of the Peaks or Tower of Darkness, we're spoiled for choice in terms of draw supporters at the moment. So a raw draw 4, assuming that that's always going to be drawing 4 based on the deck that you're playing it in, still isn't quite as strong as some of the other options we have. So yeah, just a little bit too weak, even in decks that really prioritize playing lots of stadiums.
Onto Grusher, it draws cards until you have 5 in your hand. However, if you have no energy cards attached to any of your Pokemon, you draw up to 7 instead. Drawing up to 7 isn't actually that big of a payoff, but this does remind me of a few supporters that we have in the past where there's some weird checkpoints that you have to get through. There are actually probably a number of decks that can end up, as it comes back into your turn, having no other energy cards in play. You know, if you're using Gardevoir to power up and heavily damage things, you expect them to get knocked out on the return. And all sorts of other decks can do a very similar thing where, especially like Lugia, you can constantly re-establish new threats just by pulling lots of energy out all in one go. So there are theoretically decks that could use this supporter, but like Jack just said, we have so many better ones out there. The dig of seeing 7 fresh cards or Aiono just being an option in the early game and late game is going to mean this deck never really, this card never really gets a look in.
Next up, we have Saguero. Heal up to 50 damage from 2 of your Pokemon. We've seen similar effects to this. Seabold is the one from the Rapid Strike sets that, again, has never really seen any play. People have started to maybe discuss whether it could be a bit of a counter towards some of these Lost Box strategies, particularly things like Sableye. But we have plenty of healing options right now that I think outclass it. And realistically, a lot of the time, there's not huge amounts of time where a Sableye will necessarily be spreading to multiple targets anyway. A lot of the time they'll be almost using it as sort of a sniping effect, or maybe cleaning something up. So I think realistically, there's very rarely going to be situations where your opponent has sort of split the damage in such a way that you get huge amounts of value from this. And because of it, we have, if you're ever in that sort of situation, we have much better options to have much stronger healing effects anyway.
On to the items then, and we're starting off with a card returning to the TCG. I'm sure many people are familiar with Super Rod. It shuffles up to 3 in any combination of Pokemon and basic energies from your discard pile up to your deck. Of course, that up to text is actually an upgrade on previous Super Rods, which you may have played in the past, where you had to take 3. But yeah, now you have your choice. But this is a massive upgrade to the options that we have right now in the game, because they are all supporter-based. I know Clara is fantastic at immediately giving you access to those cards and putting them kind of like straight back into play, and Miriam can get more Pokemon all in one go, but having to use an item card is just so much more flexible, allows you to use other supporters throughout your turn, which just makes it a far better card, and it means that we're getting the deepest digs into our deck with those researches, or being able to recover Pokemon and boss on the same turn. All of these factors mean that Super Rod is going to be a fantastic card and essentially overtake the other options that we have in pretty much every archetype, I think. Maybe there is some reason for Lost Box players to still play like a Clara or 2, possibly the Charizard build will still play Clara, but certainly Gate builds will love seeing Super Rod, because it allows you to put cards back into the deck, which is actually where you prefer to have them, so you can Mirage Gate those energy immediately back out. It's definitely an upgrade for Gardevoir players, and Chien Pao Baxcalibur decks are all going to be using this card. Even if it is just that one count in a number of these archetypes, it's going to be way more beneficial than having to cram in supporter cards and sort of pick the right time to use that supporter. This is much more flexible, you can just play it as you go sort of thing, and it's going to be fantastic for recovering both Pokemon and energy when you need them.
Next up, we have another reprint, Superior Energy Retrieval. And this is a pretty much an identical reprint, along with a deck that it really saw success in. So it lets you discard 2 cards from your hand. And if you do, you put 4 basic energy cards from your discard pile into the hand, not including any cards that you discarded with the effect of this card. So essentially, you're just rebuilding your hand full of energy cards. And as you'll see when we get to the Pokemon, there is a fantastic I call it a fantastic new archetype that we've seen in the past, Chien Pao Baxcalibur, which Joe's just mentioned, that lets you flood a load of energy onto the board and do huge amounts of damage and then discard all of those energies. So works fantastically in there, and that's pretty much exactly why we're warranting this a 5-star, because we think the Chien Pao Baxcalibur deck is a real solid archetype. But outside of sort of that obvious synergy, there's actually some interesting synergy with some other things like Cherrim and stuff. Whilst they're not going to be quite as powerful as Chien Pao Baxcalibur, Cherrim Snorlax is actually a pretty interesting archetype that is one of these 1-prize archetypes that actually is able to deal with Lost Box quite well, which is interesting, but it doesn't really perform particularly well into some of these other 2-prize archetypes. because it doesn't have great ways of or great other attackers. Being able to recover those energy can definitely help with that, though. So we could see some sort of flash in the pan success in some of these other quote unquote rain dancey style decks, in particular Cherin. But realistically, the 5-star is completely off the back of the Chien Pao Excalibur combo that you're going to be seeing a lot of once Paldea Evolved has been released.
Onto the sort of less interesting items then. We have Delivery Drone. You flip 2 coins. If both are heads, you can search your deck for a card and put it directly into your hand. That's only 25% of the time that this card is useful. Every other time, it's going to be a blank in the deck. We've seen old PC not too long ago, and it saw literally no play. And there's actually a downgrade to an old Victory Medal card. I actually think Victory Medal is low-key, like, kind of playable. But yeah, with this many bad outcomes, it's just not going to be a useful enough card in the game.
Next up, we have Fighting Milk. You can only play this card if you have more prizes remaining than your opponent. So this is another one of these sort of effects that works better if you're behind. And it's just heal 60 damage from one of your Pokemon. Realistically, again, we've already mentioned there's other healing options in the format that seem a little bit stronger. Maybe this is a hark back to some of these sort of quad VMAX decks that just play a load of healing. We've had a couple of these decks in the past, and a couple of their healing options have rotated. So maybe this goes into those, but realistically, these decks have never been super viable. So overall, probably this probably won't bring them back into the fray too much.
Onto the only tool card of the set, Charm of Courage. It's actually a very good one. The basic Pokemon this card is attached to gets an additional 50 hit points. That's going to be really handy, seeing as though we have a number of very playable basic EX Pokemon in the format right now. We, of course, know Miraidon quite well. It has been doing fairly well, not in really droves, but here and there has been very solid. And just pushing your Miraidon or your other, 2-prize Pokemon slightly out of reach of certain Pokemon could be absolutely massive. As we know, these are sort of racing-based decks, so trying to keep yourself out of range is going to be a real big upside for you. Chien Pao could easily try and put this into their deck list at the same time, and we know that Tingloo is already naturally very bulky, so adding Charm of Courage into the deck list can really lean into that strategy, especially when Tingloo doesn't have great energy acceleration behind it outside of the early turns. Making yourself stick around on the board for 1 or 2 additional turns going to give you that sort of time to turn attached to other Pokemon. So that's going to be a really important tool for those sorts of decks. There is, of course, a combination with Drifloon and Champions Festival, where Balloon Blast can actually deal 330 damage if you have that Charm and Festival and use it to heal 10 from your Drifloon before getting an additional energy on. This can be a massive uptrade in Gardevoir EX decks if you want to have it. I'm personally a believer that I think just Reversal Energy and Shining Arcana is going to be a better way to go because it takes up less space in the deck. But that's not to say that people won't be trying out this combo, because it is a very powerful basic Pokemon that can uptrade. In general, Charm of Courage has a lot of homes where it could potentially go in, and that's why we're giving it a 4-star rating.
Onto the stadiums, and this is one I mentioned earlier on, Artisan. Once during each player's turn, that player may search their deck for a basic Pokemon that doesn't have a rule box and put it onto their bench. Then that player shuffles their deck. So this is essentially a nest ball for players that play these non-rule box Pokemon. First things first, notably, this is a stadium card that actually can be a bit more one-sided than various other stadium cards that we see, because there will be certain archetypes that always have a rule box or have far more rule boxes than not. So they have diminishing returns from a card like this. So always when we see these kinds of stadiums that aren't as simple as a mirrored effect, they're always a little bit stronger. This is going to be really, really good for various different archetypes. A lot of these evolving decks are going to love to see a card like this, because even though they have plenty of stadiums that they play at the moment, realistically, the number one priority for all of these evolving decks is always going to be getting into the game. And no matter how many ball search cards you play, you're probably going to want more, and having stadiums that work as ball search cards is going to be really, really good, even if they do end up giving your opponent an additional effect, because you're getting the effect from Artisan first, you're able to evolve first, and all of this kind of stuff then comes into play. So for the evolving decks like Gardevoir, it's going to be a really, really solid card. Even if it just ends up being sort of a 1-of, maybe a 2-of, it's still going to be really impactful the turns that you see Artisan pretty early. We could see this played in some Lost Box variants as well. Obviously, there's various different sort of mindsets behind Lost Box. There's sort of playing the beach courts and doing that. There's playing things like Pokestop and lots of additional item cards. But now you could also play maybe 1 or 2 Artisan as well, just to find those early confays and make sure, again, you're getting into the game, you're starting to flower select into your combo pieces and into your powerful turns and your sort of power spike cards. So could be a nice way of also additionally or making those kinds of decks a little bit more consistent. And finally, we've got a Block Snorlax on here, pretty much representing that any kind of inherent consistency boost to control style decks can never be ignored, because typically one thing that holds control decks back is not being able to efficiently or consistently pull off their strategy, and having a generic searching card like Artisan that searches out for these random basics that you end up playing in control decks can be really, really strong. So whilst we're not necessarily saying this pushes control, this is definitely another tool that helps control become a more relevant archetype going forward. So one to definitely keep in mind for control lovers as well. So yeah, really, really flexible card. I think could see in a variety of different archetypes, and also a really nice stadium that actually doesn't necessarily always benefit your opponent as well, which I think always feels quite cool for deck building wise as well. So yeah, really, really interesting one. Looking forward to seeing exactly what home this has in various different decks.
Onto Calamitous Mountain. Whenever a player attaches an energy card from their hand to one of their basic non-water Pokemon, put 2 counters onto that Pokemon. I really don't think there are many practical applications for this, but I did come up with a couple of interesting funny ones where we could possibly push the likes of Radiant Heatran and Bisharp's damage output into the sort of high 900 or 700 damage range, which is very combo orientated and fun for some ladder shenanigans, but is going to be far too convoluted and difficult to pull off in regular standard games too often.
Next up, we have Calamitous Wasteland. The retreat cost of each non-fighting basic Pokemon is 1 colorless more. We've recently had Galamine, and that saw, again, some play in some controlling archetypes. Realistically, I think this is probably going to be pretty limited to there. If you're looking for a more prize-taking archetype, there's obviously Spidops Leafeon, which has seen pretty much no success, but is a natural partnership. And this seems like a great stadium for that kind of deck. Additionally, again, there's a couple of controlling style cards that potentially could, or controlling archetypes that could potentially benefit from this. We have the Pulling Currents Manaphy, which is a promo that started to see some playing controllers here and there that lets you put basic Pokemon from your opponent's hand onto their bench, so then you can try and boss them up next turn and trap them. And similarly, Yveltal trying to ditch some energy on your opponent's Pokemon whilst bringing up something with a heavy retreat cost to trap it in the active. So yeah, realistically, again, not necessarily going to be the card that pushes any of these archetypes, but is an additional tool to keep in mind going forward.
Onto Lesson Studio. The attacks of each player's Stage 1 Evolution Pokemon do 10 more damage to their opponent's active Pokemon, and that's before applying weakness and resistance. There aren't really that many cards that I scouted in like stage 1s that could really do with just a 10 damage augment. I think the best one I found would be potentially for Zoro boxes. They could try having Breaks In getting an extra 10 damage involved to push itself to 250, which then means you could belt up to 280. But that's also assuming that you're not using DTE, so really are low on the ground for how many options we have for this. I looked at Clodsire EX as well, which we'll get onto in more detail later, but that could allow you to actually hit 220, even with a double turbo energy attached to the Clodsire, if you are using Sneasler at the same time. So massive wombo combo. Ultimately, it's only a 10 damage mod, and it's limited to only stage 1s, and I've not found any where it's that impactful just yet, so I see no home for this card. Always keep an eye on damage mods though, because sometimes they randomly crop up, but I've not been able to see any obvious combos as of yet.
And onto the special energy cards, there was a significant lack of special energy in base Scarlet and Violet, but this set really makes up for it. There's some brilliant ones, and the first is Jet Energy. This is just a basic colorless. This is just a colorless energy, no sort of rainbow-y effects. But when you attach this card from your hand to a bench Pokemon, you can then switch that Pokemon into your active, into the active position. So basically, working as a switching card is going to be brilliant, because it's for things like Mews and Comphase and these Lost Box decks, or even just getting something into the active without having to burn a switch. It's going to be great because you're still getting an attachment for the turn. In Lost Boxes, case specifically, it actually almost serves as 2 flower selectings, because if you attach it, you push the next Comfey into the active that gets to flower selecting, and then you can pay retreat with the Jet Energy into another Comfey. So this is almost like 2 Comfeys, or 2 flower selectings in one card, which is really, really good, especially in some some of these lost box archetypes which don't necessarily need energy attachments early on because they're gate based, or they are sort of Sableye Charizard based, where it's very low energy in the late game. So they have energy attachments to burn in the early game. So Jet Energy really fits into there quite nicely. It also really pushes an interesting new way of looking at Lugia, being able to search out for Jet Energies in the same way you would anyway, but also having access to attaching Jet Energies. We've seen in Japan has sort of spawned a bit of a new colorless based archetype of Lugia, which we'll discuss more a little bit later on with a couple of other cards. But yeah, it's a really, really interesting card, and I think whenever you pile sort of 2 effects together, a switch and an energy attachment, whilst they may seem like relatively low impact effects overall, combining them into one is actually going to be really, really useful and serve a lot of purposes. So yeah, it's going to mean that you're able to get your whichever sort of various Pokemon into the active position much easier. It's going to open up new doors for current archetypes. It's a very, very powerful card, and I think we're going to see quite a bit of it in various decks going forward.
Onto Reversal Energy. As long as this card is attached to a Pokemon, it provides colorless. However, if you have more prize cards remaining than your opponent, and if this card is attached to an evolution that doesn't have a rule box, this card provides every type of energy and 3 at a time. So what a massive, great new addition for comeback mechanics. Creatures did not disappoint with this set. They've brought us Aiono and Reversal Energy now, and this card has a number of great targets already in the format. We've already known that Gardevoir EX is one of the strongest contenders, but getting this card and Aiono combined is 2 massive upgrades for the deck. This can be fantastic to just instantly attach onto your Gardevoir or Gallade without having to damage them, to be quite helpful as attacking threats into Lost Zone box, because now they can sit out of range of a number of their 1-prize attackers. But you can also think about attaching this alongside shoving 6 energy onto your Shining Arcana Gardevoir and push yourself into 1-hit KO range of V-Star and VMAX Pokemon and other EXs. So it really turns the Gardevoir deck into a mostly 1-prize build, I think, with less reliance on Zacian V, and just having double Shining Arcana now in the deck list, and sometimes even Gallade as well. You can just get massive uptrades provided you are behind in the game, and Gardevoir typically likes to be behind a turn or two, just by nature of how it tries to set up. It doesn't play many rare candy, it mostly relies on just getting lots of Curlier rolling, and if you hire all the candy, that's great news, but now you have a great comeback if you don't, and can really burst a ton of damage onto the field all in one go, with less reliance on finding, like 10 energy that you've cycled through the deck early. Now you can do it with just 6, which is a much easier number, provided you find the Reversal Energy. I also think the Luxray combination is another great option here that we get from this set. Luxray is a lightning type Pokemon, so you can now be hitting for a crucial weakness in Lugia as well as Palkia V-Star. And Luxray actually has a very similar effect to Reversal Energy. You can immediately bench this Pokemon as if it was a basic, and attach that Reversal Energy all on the same turn to immediately access the Wild Charge attack. Now, Reversal Energy could be pulled out of the deck by Archeops, so I feel like this could be a combination card that we see in Lugia decks to give you some mirror advantage. But I also think this combination could be put into, again, Gardevoir could be looking to play this. If you're already playing Reversal Energies, why not add a Luxray for type coverage, potentially, for an easier uptrade in the early game against the Lugia. It could also find its way into Lost Zone archetypes, this Luxray, with Reversal package. I don't think there's many easy ways to get this going, and we'll talk more about Luxray in terms of just on its own as a standalone good card, possibly with like Mirage Gate in Lost Box. But yeah, Reversal Energy makes this stuff happen. I think these are currently the most high-profile cards that I'm going to see Reversal Energy in, but there are so many Stage 1 things we could look towards now in a Zoro toolbox. Not always damaging either. Things like Wugtrio is pretty much never taking prizes, so you're always having your reversals live, which I think is quite funny. So there's going to be a number of other Pokemon that come out of the woodwork which are given viability because that silly attack cost of 3 Rainbow Energies can be fulfilled all in one attachment, which gives many evolution decks a real springboard to get back into the game. Exceptional card, great design, and it's going to really push the card that you can see on screen right now.
Next up, we have Luminous Energy. This is another rainbow style effect. As long as this energy is attached to a Pokemon, it provides every type of energy, but only one at a time. If the card this is attached to has any other special energy attached, this only provides a colorless. So it's it's pretty much a reprint, actually, of multi-energy from back in the day, which was a very, very popular card. Yeah, this is a really, really interesting one. First off, this is a very interesting card for toolbox style decks, and in particular, we could see this having various or being the backbone of various different attackers in like a controlling style archetype, which is quite interesting. I think this is probably one of the weaker uses for Luminous Energy, but definitely does open doors in terms of finding these random attackers that have sort of a 1 energy attack cost that realistically can never really work with one another. This way, being able to play Luminous Energy works brilliantly, and you can even play some Ditto just to copy, if they're all basics, to copy them as well, which is quite fun. Similarly, we've seen very, very similar sort of style cards in the past work well with low energy attackers, and basically one of our best low energy attackers is Radiant Charizard. Radiant Charizard has already seen success in Lugia in the past, back in the days where we had plenty of better special energy, but we could quite easily add in 1 or 2 Luminous Energy to a Lugia deck now and just have Radiant Charizard as a late game sweeper, taking the last couple of prizes, because you're able to search it out whenever you want with Archeops. Plus, this also works as an energy in the early turns as well, for various other attackers, and maybe you can even weave in some other low energy attackers as well. Finally, for Lost Box variants, we've obviously seen various different Lost Box variants that look to play Sky Sealed Stone and a variety of different weakness cards that do high damage on specific targets like Raikou and Zapdos, and because of that, you can even work with Luminous Energy. These work with Luminous Energy quite well as well, because Zapdos obviously starts to reduce its own attack cost, which means you're sometimes able to just attack for Luminous Energy, which is great. But there's plenty of other basic energies in these kinds of decks as well, to be able to fill up the rest of Galarian Zapdos' attack cost whilst not turning off the Luminous Energy attack. So you only still have to play sort of psychics and waters and whatever, and you still have access to Luminous Energy. Similarly with Raikou, you can attach the Luminous Energy as that lightning energy and then gate another one on, or just attach any other energy early on and be able to find a Luminous Energy later on in the game. So yeah, definitely opens up the doors for a pretty interesting style of Lost Zone deck. We'll have to see whether this sort of takes over some of the other gate builds or some of the other sort of countering Sky Seal Stone builds that we've seen successful in the past. Yeah, very, very flexible card. It doesn't feel anywhere near as strong as sort of the power spike that something like a Reverse Energy gives. This is just a very, very flexible card for a couple of archetypes that we can see definitely seeing some success. So that's why it's that sort of mid rating of 3. Not going to be sort of meta warping as Reverse Energy and Jet Energy are, but definitely some cool applications in a couple of archetypes that are doing well right now.
Jack already alluded to this sort of new wave of Snorlax Weirdeer in Lugia archetypes, and Therapy Energy is another reason for that archetype sort of sprouting out of this set. As long as this card is attached to a Pokemon, it provides colorless energy. The Pokemon this card is attached to can't be asleep, confused, or paralyzed, and if it's already got one of those statuses, you recover immediately as you attach this Therapy Energy. This is fantastic for that Snorlax, so you can thump freely and not have to worry about your sleeping. So having this combination with Jet Energy gives the deck a number of colorless energy to use for the Snorlax, the Lugia themselves, and Weirdeer. So that seems to be the biggest combination. At first, I was really high on this sort of archetype. I thought Snorlax Weirdeer was going to challenge the single strike approach, but what I've seen as of late is a real willingness for Arceus players and even some Lugia players to play Duraludon, and I think this approach of Lugia doesn't really have any answer to that Duraludon VMAX combination, so that makes me a little bit skeptical and makes me think it's probably going to be less viable than the single strike build that we already know from Lugia. The one thing I will say is that if we're not having to worry about Duraludon, and if this doesn't see like enough play to be worth teching against, it is a great alternate option of Lugia where you are very single prize focused, where you can have pretty much the entire board after Lugia V-Star is knocked out as just your Archeops and Lax, and then just only spring Weirdeer V into play when it's mandatory. So I think that's possibly going to be a deck, but it's never really going to hit those heights because it's such an easy archetype to counter. The other thing we should note about Therapy Energy is that we do have a Wigglytuff from this set. It's a stage 1 Pokemon that can search your deck for a Therapy Energy and attach it to one of your Pokemon. So one Wigglytuff is like half an Archeops, so that's something you can try and look for if you want to have some universal colourless energy acceleration. It's a little bit convoluted, and I don't think it's going to be that good, but it's another nod for Therapy Energy.
And that's our trainers. Feel free to take a quick pause here if you just want a reminder of how we've rated things. But without further ado, let's jump into the Pokemon.
So for the first EX, we have Chien Pao and Baxcalibur. Myself and Jack have already alluded to it already with a couple of cards from the trainers, but this is a brand new combination that we are getting, where we have the stage 2 Baxcalibur on the right hand side of your screen, which allows us to attach a basic energy from our hand to one of our Pokemon as often as we like during our turn. It's the return of Rain Dance. It's a 160 hit point Mon, and being a water type, we have easy access to grab Candy Baxcalibur immediately via Irida, so that's a fantastic combination. One of the reasons why I think it's going to be quite a reliable turn 2 Candy combo is the fact that we have Irida to fall back on to make that happen. It also has an attack which just does 130 vanilla with no downside, which is actually pretty handy. This can get into the mix into other single prize matchups. It can knock out a lot of the sort of early attackers from Lost Zone box and stays well out of that range, so it can be sometimes frustrating for them to deal with. And then we have the Chien Pao EX, which really makes this combination far easier to pull off, because the Shivery Chill ability, if this Pokemon's in the active position, allows us to search for 2 basic water and put them directly into our hand and shuffle our deck afterwards. So it's like using a Capacious Bucket just for getting Chien Pao in the active. So we get them immediately into the hand, then Baxcalibur them all into play, which is an obvious combination. And Chien Pao EX is also our sort of higher damage output option that this deck has at its disposal, with Hailblade for 2 water, dealing 60 times the amount of water energy we discard from all of our Pokemon in play. So this scales quite nicely. It might take, 5 or 6 energy all to hit the discard pile in one turn, but we've already discussed that Superior Energy Retrieval is a great option here to give us some reloads, and we have the Shivery Chill sort of between turns as an option, or we can use the likes of Switch, Escape Rope, or even Skater's Park to get multiple activations of Chien Pao EX on a single turn to really empty the deck of our waters to just give us remaining, helpful supporter cards and these superior energy retrievals for those reloads. We have a number of potentially powerful single prize Pokemon, which also makes me think this could be a top competitor. We have the pressure of a turn 2 Radiant Greninja, as long as you can candy into Baxcalibur. We have some powerful sniping from Kyogre. You can do a 180 damage snipe, which is very dangerous as a single prize option. We have Kyurem, which could potentially be very similar to Chien Pao, but in a single prize form. It would require the deck to play some Metal Energy as well, which isn't always the easiest, but it could have some big uptrade potential. And as we know, Palkia V-Star, very powerful card. It could give this deck a backup option. If you happen to whiff Rare Candy, but do get the early Palkia developed, you could still Star Portal and maybe get an attack in with Subspace Swell, or if that's enough for a Hailblade, you could still use that Star Portal, get Greninja going, get Chien Pao going with turn attachments and whatnot, and still have tempo at your disposal. So I think the deck all comes nice and neatly in this one set, where the Chien Pao and Baxcalibur have so much internal synergy. The superior energy retrieval means we don't necessarily run out of resources too easily, and you can see that this is already going to be the shell of a very consistent deck. We've seen how great Irida is at getting VIP pass in the opening stages. We know it's going to be a great supporter to use on turn 2 as well for rare candy combos. So it seems like a very neat and tidy archetype that has a good mixture of higher damage output, multi-prizes, and enough single prize threats that you can sort of fight that fight with the other single prize archetypes that we have in format.
Next up, we have Squawkabilly EX. This is another spiritual reprint to a very, very successful card. This set is full of really, really cool reprints, slightly updated to have slightly different effects. Squawkabilly EX is a 160 HP 2-prize colorless type with the show off ability that says once during your first turn, you may discard your hand and draw 6 cards. You can't use more than one show off ability each turn. So basically, this is very similar to the Dene from the past, which is a very, very strong card, but can only be used on your first turn. But the upside is you're able to use this at any point. It's not a coming into play effect, so it means if you start your one squawk ability, because realistically, because you can only use one squawk ability during a game, basically, even though it says during your turn, realistically this is one show-off ability during the game. You're never really going to want to be playing more than one, except in very, very niche situations. So if you happen to start your one-off squawk ability, you're still able to use that show-off ability, which is really, really nice in terms of sort of it always felt a bit bad starting with a Shaman or a Dene or anything like that. So still being able to use the ability with that payoff that you can only use it on the first turn, I think is a great way of balancing the card. I think this is actually a really, really well-designed card. Also has the Psych Up attack for one colorless energy that deals 20 damage, and you can attach up to 2 basic energy from your discard pile to one of your bench Pokemon. So also a nice little setup attack for some additional support there as well. It's a really interesting card, and we're giving it the 4 out of 5 rather than the 5 out of 5, just because the exact uses for this card still seem a little bit sketchy. Tingloo, I think, is probably the deck that will definitely be using this, because the deck does not have any great draw power. So I think this will definitely see play in Tingloo. This could see play in some other decks as well. Things like Arceus really stick out a lot of the time, because a lot of the time you just need Arceus plus energy to get going on your first turn. So that's a nice way of being able to hopefully get a little bit of extra dig to make sure you do start the game off right, because obviously from then turn 2 you have theoretically you have Starbirth, which then sets you up for hopefully the rest of the game going forward. So could be nice in those kinds of decks. We also could see it in things like Lugia as well. I think it's a little bit weaker in Lugia because, again, it's another deck that's really important. It's really key to find your basic Pokemon. But this does have the upside of maybe being able to discard some Archeops as well. So another way of being able to get rid of those cards when we have a bit of a much smaller pool of ways of being able to discard Archeops. So that's quite nice as well. You're able to find this with VIP Pass and Nest Ball, which again is really nice compared to older Dene and sort of Shaman of the past. So that's also a nice benefit. And you can even collapse Stadium away this once you've used it. Obviously, it's a bit of a sitting duck. It's got 160 HP. It's a relatively weak 2-prizer. So there are ways to eliminate this from the board as well, which is really nice. So yeah, really, really strong archetype. We could see this in various other archetypes as well. Some of these 1-prize archetypes that have discard synergies. There's a new Wings of Union deck, which we'll talk about later. But even things like the Dondozo Tatsugiri always kind of struggled for ways to discard Tatsugiris, so that could be nice. Zoroark, again, also is another one that loves to see plenty of cool attackers in the discard, so this could be an additional way of getting those into the discard whilst also digging an extra 6 cards to try and find Zoruas and Nest Balls and such. So yeah, you would probably think we're going to rate this a 5-star, but I think there will definitely be situations where you don't really have space for a Squawkabilly, or you don't really want to spend your ball search cards finding Squawkabilly. You know, there'll be situations where you're only finding Squawkabilly if you have an extra ball search card anyway, so it's sort of like a win more card. But the fact that this gives inherent consistency to some of these decks, especially Arceus, I think is what pushes it definitely into the 4-star range. I think this isn't going to be a guaranteed card in pretty much any deck other than maybe some of these Arceus archetypes. But it seems like a key player in those. And realistically, this can be splashed in absolutely anything. There really isn't a downside to playing this in pretty much any deck, especially with something like Collapsed in format, which is already seeing play in a variety of different archetypes for various other reasons. There's not really a massive downside to adding a Squawkabilly into your deck anyway. So very, very flexible card. May end up being a 5-star, but we're pretty sure it's just a 4-star just based on the archetypes we definitely think it's going to go into. But yeah, we'll have to wait and see whether this actually turns out to be a little bit stronger and ends up in pretty much everything, because you can never really turn down an additional 6 cards at some point during your first turn. So if you're able to play the ball search to support this, could be a very key consistency piece to pretty much any deck going.
Onto that Tingloo EX then. I alluded to it earlier, 240 base hit points is absolutely monstrous for a basic. It has the Earthen Curse ability as well. As long as this Pokemon is in the active spot, your opponent's Pokemon that have any damage counters on them have no abilities excluding Pokemon EX. That means if we can tag certain Pokemon via the likes of Hawlucha or Radiant Alakazam, or Tingloo's own attack, Land Scoop, which does 150, for 3 fighting and also puts 2 counters on one of your opponent's bench Pokemon, you are then waggling the finger and saying, no, you cannot use your abilities. This can be a great way at shutting down all sorts of engines. We've just talked about Baxcalibur, how that's pretty much the backbone of the new Chien Pao EX deck. We know that tagging the likes of Radiant Greninja and Curliers can be really detrimental to the development of all sorts of archetypes. Stopping potentially Archeops for a turn or two could be very huge, bearing in mind they are likely to still play Radiant Serena, but possibly you can tag that card first, then go after the Archeops at the same time. So you can actually do a lot with this Earthen Curse. It covers a wide array of the formats. The reason why we're not giving it that much higher of a rating is that 3 energy cost is still pretty pricey. Very early on, it shouldn't be a big issue because we can try and use the likes of Trekking Shoes, our own Greninja sometimes, or if you're going to play the Alakazam, you can try and spoon things around instead. But also Squawkabilly and just using research to try and bin off as many fighting energy as possible so we can use that Dino Cry and get Tingloo EX ready on turn 2 of the game. We're hoping that Charm of Courage can push us into that higher hit points, and we're hoping that the disruption of Earthen Curse means that we can stick around for a turn or two. Sometimes if your opponent's hand is good enough, they're still just going to wipe out the Tingloo and you're not going to have much of a backup. You'll sit there just trying to Dino Cry power up and hope to dodge boss's orders, and things will get pretty out of control pretty quickly. But from our limited testing so far with Tingloo, it's kind of been a feast or famine where sometimes the opponent just can't do much because you lock down their board so early with the Earthen Curse, and other times the opponent just had boss's orders or whatever else to undo the soft lock and then just sort of piece apart your board because your damage output isn't all that high. So definitely an archetype that we have to respect in the format, but bear in mind this is only a soft lock. Gust will get you out of this, as will any healing cards which happen to be in archetypes. So keep those things in mind. I am low-key worried about this because you can never disrespect ability lock, but we don't think that this archetype has that sort of staying power throughout the game to keep up with the other decks in format right now.
On to Meowskarada EX, a Stage 2 Grass-type Pokemon with 310 HP. Has the Bouquet Magic ability that says you must discard a Grass energy from your hand in order to use the ability. Once during your turn, you may choose one of your opponent's bench Pokemon and put 3 damage counters onto it. So in a format where we have lots of evolving basics, it's actually a really, really strong ability because you're able to potentially with a couple of Meowskaradas punish some of these evolving basics and take multiple knockouts in a turn, which is really, really cool. We also have the Scratching Nails attack, which for 2 colorless energy deals 100 damage, but if your opponent's active Pokemon has any damage counts on it already, this attack does 120 more. So now you can see why we've got this Radiant Alakazam on here. You can Bouquet Magic something onto the bench and then Painful Spoons a counter onto the active and buff up Scratching Nails' damage. This is a 2 colorless energy attack cost as well, so we can use double turbo, which yes, that will reduce that damage a little bit, but 2 for 200 pretty consistently is not too bad. We also have things like energy retrieval and stuff to be able to keep cycling those Bouquet Magics as well. There's various other sort of grass support we have, which is quite interesting. We have Lilligant with that Star Perfume attack, ability that lets you search for I think it's up to 5 grass Pokemon or grass energy cards. So that's sort of going to help you push into maybe the early game of getting your first and second Meowskaradas and a couple of energy going. And there's a couple of cool Zarude Vs as well, which you could maybe use in combination with Meowskarada and its Bouquet Magic ability. I think the biggest issue with this is it's a Stage 2 that doesn't have huge amounts of payoff. It's a very strong ability, but in comparison to other Stage 2s we have, particularly Gardevoir EX, this is very strong, but nowhere near as strong as something like that, and really does rely on having multiple Stage 2s out to start actually performing really strong things on the board. Obviously, I think it's always going to be difficult to compare some of these Stage 2s to Gardevoir just because it is so unbelievably strong. It has a much better sort of basic and Stage 1 line as well, so comparing them feels a little bit unfair, but it's what we have to do because Meowskarada will naturally see or be a competitor for that anyway, and having to get multiple Meowskaradas out to still sometimes not even get a KO on an active Pokemon feels really bad. It's great at setting up stuff on the bench, but it takes a couple of turns to do so, and even so, you're still struggling to get up to that 280 range for some of these V-Stars and stuff. which can be a bit awkward. So yeah, it's a really interesting one, and this sort of a lot of being able to use a lot of these bouquet magics in one turn actually does seem quite intimidating, especially when there's various evolving basics around and Radiant Alakazam to fix the maths here and there. But I think overall, it's just going to be lacking the consistency to actually be able to put up a fight in those matchups, as well as struggling to reach over the line against some of these slightly tankier decks where you need to be dealing with whatever's in the active rather than necessarily setting up the one on the bench, because that's going to be the one that's sort of tearing through you. So yeah, it's definitely a strong card, but not quite strong enough to see huge amounts of success, we feel.
On to Tinkerton EX and the single prize Tinkerton, because these kind of have inter-synergy between the two of them. First of all, the EX is just 300 hit points, which is quite low for a stage 2 EX that we've come to know, but it does have the big hammer attack. For 2 colourless, you do 30 times the number of cards in your hand. So here's the idea: grow as big a hand size as possible. And this is where we can take a look at the Tinkerton with that gather materials ability, allowing us to discard a card from our hand in order to draw 3 cards. So you can see exactly what we're going for here. It's going to be a very setup heavy deck. We're likely going to try and also get Milotic in the mix, so our opponent cannot simply Iono our hopes and dreams away to reduce our damage output. And we're going to hope to just spam these Tinkerton, maybe even add other draw Pokemon into the deck. The likes of Crobat and Golbat could be useful. A mini package with Fog Crystals, because we're a Psychic type, with Radiant Greninja, and possibly having Energy Retrieval and Superior as a way to get pluses in the hand could be a little mini internal package, which I think could be interesting. A small thing to note is that with the second attack of Tinkerton, we also have a wall breaking effect, which is also quite nice, so we don't have to worry about adding in any other attackers. We can completely rely on just the Tinkerton themselves. I think overall it is going to be convoluted. You end up having to play a lot of the cards that you draw into on the first couple of turns. We're still looking to hit rare candy combos galore here, so I think it's going to be a lot of work, but also a lot of fun as an archetype. And if you do get those explosive starts and you develop Milotic, you are putting your opponent in a really bad position, so it can be overwhelming at times.
Next up, we have Copperage EX. This is a huge 300 HP Stage 1 Pokemon. So we've just said how 300 is a little bit weak for a Stage 2, but on a Stage 1, it's absolutely monstrous, especially when you also take into account the Bronze Body ability that says this Pokemon takes 30 less damage from attacks. So all of a sudden, you have effective 330 HP, and if your opponent isn't able to deal with that in one hit, then you're going to have even more. You're going to have 360, maybe even 390 effectively. When you combine that with some of the healing options we have, there's a new Oricorio, there's Radiant Serena, we've even got Crystal Cave, and even something like a V-Guard Energy to help reduce the amount of damage we've got coming in. Yeah, Copperage becomes very tanky very quickly, which is quite scary, to be honest. In terms of the attack, Nosequake for 2 Metal in the Colors deals 260 damage, but it also does 30 damage to each of your benched Pokemon. So a bit of a downside there, and something that you have to keep in mind, that maybe your opponent can actually try and ignore the Copperager and abuse the fact that you're damaging your bench and try and catch up on prizes that way. So definitely something to keep in mind. But yeah, 260 for 3 on a 2-prize 330 HP Pokemon is pretty crazy, to be honest. And this actually is a little bit interesting. The first thought thoughts that naturally come with this are, how do we accelerate these energy? And I think Magnezone is the first one most people go to. We've seen Miraidon, Magnezone, Dialga see sort of flash in the pan success here and there. More of a sort of fun deck than necessarily a strong deck, but you could very easily apply the exact same sort of principles to a Copperage attacker as well. Maybe even actually getting some space back, because you don't need anywhere near as many energy cards potentially. But interestingly, we could also see it working perhaps with sort of a Comfey Mirage Gate package in the same way that we've seen Goodra work in the past. Now, admittedly, Goodra needed two different types of energy, water and metal, so naturally played into Mirage Gate a little bit more. But obviously, these Lost Zone decks can always play things like Sableye anyway, so you can find a way of being able to weave a couple of additional energy types into the deck, and just having a second metal as your manual attachment, getting a Copperage out of nowhere. Now, you will naturally be damaging your Comfeys quite badly, so you probably have to be a much slower You probably have to be much slower than regular Lost Zone decks that like to put loads of Confe down and just turbo to 10. This is probably something that you just naturally build towards with one, maybe two Confes and Chorus, and instead you're still utilizing things like Cram in the early turns to not overbench and end up sort of ruining the tankiness of Copperage in the late game. It doesn't necessarily seem stronger than Gudra. It just seems a little bit different, and it'll be interesting to see whether this sort of aspect of a Lost Zone Gudra deck can be adapted to a Copperage variant. I think the stats on this card make it interesting alone. 260 for 3 is absurd. 300 HP on a stage 1 is absurd when you have that bronze body ability. It's just about whether we can find a practical use to make best to best make use of these stats. And I think that's going to be the challenge of this card, whether we can actually make something work or whether raw stats on a card aren't enough to bring it into the limelight. And I think we're leaning on the side of, unfortunately, these raw stats aren't going to be bringing this forward into a popular archetype. So that's why I've rated it down at the 2-star. But keep an eye on this one. I think there's definitely room for this card in the future because the numbers on this card just make it so unbelievably powerful that I think we're going to see some play somewhere with this.
Onto Noivern EX. It's a dragon type, stage 1 with 260 hit points. It has the covert flight attack for 2 colorless energy, dealing 70 and prevents all damage done to this Pokemon by the attacks from basic Pokemon, very similar to Flying Pikachu, but obviously a much lower damage output, so it's far less threatening, unfortunately. But it does also have the second attack for a Psychic and Dark Energy, the Dominant Echo for 140 damage this time, and during your opponent's next turn, they can't play any special energy or stadium cards from their hand. Now, this really is quite limiting and is a massive upgrade to Shadow Mist, which is the sort of other attack that shares the same effect. And this is really putting things on a clock a lot more effectively here. I don't think Noivern EX is a good enough card on its own to sort of stand as its own deck, but I do think it could be another part of the Dragon package of Regidrago, and it gives this sort of Regidrago Arceus combination another reason to see some play, because I think right now just having the upsides of like Duraludon, Giratina, and Gudra may not be enough, but adding in this Noivern may be another part of that puzzle that then gives you possibly some slightly better matchups out there. When you're denying special energy attachments, that can be very frustrating for a number of archetypes in the game. So I think it really helps the Regidrago deck cover mostly Mew, which is what you couldn't really cover too well. And we've seen Arceus has found trouble dealing with Mew decks of late. So I do think this could be a big upgrade to that archetype. The issue being that Arcdrago is already on that sort of consistency tightrope. It definitely takes more effort than just an Arctina or just an Arcgudra on their own. So does adding in an extra optional card that you have to once again search out and find a way to discard all in one go push this deck enough to be super high tier? I'm still skeptical, but definitely some powerful attack effects and is some selling points to an Arcdrago archetype. Just not sure that it's enough to warrant this sort of clunkier approach to Arceus to see too much play.
Onto Fortress EX. This is the first Terra EX of the set that we're going to talk about. Unfortunately, this is only a 1-star, despite having a really, really cool effect. Explosive Energy is the ability. There's once during a turn, you may search your deck for up to 5 basic grass energy, and attach them to your Pokemon in any way you like, then shuffle your deck. If you search your deck in this way, this Pokemon is knocked out. So the idea here is basically use a couple of Fortress on the second turn of the game, build up your board, build up a really, really strong board, maybe Regidrago that we've just mentioned, or Shaman V-Star with the Revenge Blast attack, or even Venusaur VMAX that's just a really big, tanky mon that can heal as well as deal huge damage with Forest Storm, and then use Aiono to quite quickly put your opponent down to a very low hand size and just say basically deal with this one attacker. It's going to be tearing through whatever's in the active and I'm going to be taking 6 prizes relatively quickly. Can you sort of respond in time? Interestingly, I think this is actually one of the better time or a better effect that we've seen with this kind of thing in the past. I think it's actually pretty strong purely because we have Aiono in the format, meaning that you actually can try and pull this sort of combo off. We've seen very similar combos to this in the past. I think the bigger issue is there will be people naturally building their decks towards having lots of outs to Aiono anyway. I think some of these attackers can still be a little bit frail, things like Shaman and Regidrago. because they give up 2 prizes, typically your opponent just needs to get through one of them, which is obviously not great. I think Venusaur VMAX is actually a kind of an interesting one because you're pushing your opponent into the 7-prize game as well as having that 330 HP and the option to do some healing with Gmax Bloom in situations where you don't use Forest Storm to get a KO, so you're able to retain that tank ability. But I think it all just sounds a little bit too good to be true, unfortunately, which is a shame because this archetype does seem, or this card seems really, really cool. I think there's actually some really interesting other applications that we may end up seeing for this card in combination with Aiono, setting up other attackers maybe with more colorless costs. I actually ended up seeing a Japanese sort of more controlling style archetype. It wasn't purely control, but it used this whole Fortress Aiono package to try and lower the opponent's hand size, reduce the amount of options, and set up some or have access to these grass energy to set up some interesting sort of stronger controlling attacks on sort of cost 2 or 3 energy that have a couple of colorless in play here and there. So really, really interesting card. I think ultimately it's not quite going to see success, but really interested to see whether anyone can make this work. It's actually a card I'm really looking forward to seeing how people play around with this one.
Onto Chien EX. It's a 230 hit point grass basic Pokemon. Presumably they're giving us this card in the same set as Fortress to sort of go together. I just don't think that Chien's attacks are good enough. First of all, Devouring Ivy does 60 to one of your opponent's bench Pokemon for each prize card your opponent has taken, so straight away you can see the obvious synergy there between Fortress and this early attack. And you have Forest Burn for 3 grass and a colorless, you deal 220 damage. Now, you can make Chien pretty big. We have Kricketune in formats, and we have the likes of Charm of Courage and V-Guard Energy, thanks to having a colourless in your attack cost, to try and make a pretty chunky guy, but I just don't think you deal enough damage to sort of make up for that prize deficit that you're giving the opponents. So, not enough of a payoff, unfortunately, but you can see what they're going for.
Next up, we have Tingloo EX. This is a 190 HP fire type, which is really sad because it's actually not really kept in line with some of these other 2-prize Pokemon. So yeah, feels really, really weak, to be honest. Jealousy Singe is the first attack for a fire that discards the top 2 cards of your opponent's deck. So you've seen this similarly in Crabominable and stuff. There's never really been a deck built around this kind of attack, recently anyway. And realistically, Crabominable would probably be the way you would do it because it's much more HP and water has much more support. So realistically, this is a worse Crabominable for the first attack. Flame Surge does 100 damage for 2 fire energy, and you choose up to 3 of your bench Pokemon for each of those. You search your deck for a basic fire and attach it. Essentially, this is actually a really nice setup option, but we already have some pretty interesting, or we already have various ways of being able to accelerate fire energy without using an attack, things like Magma Basin and Raihan and stuff. But similarly, it's a very expensive attack. You're committing 2 energy on a 190 HP 2-prize Pokemon to just attach 3 energy, so it's only like a net gain of 1 energy, and you still have to split the energy up as well, so it's not like you can even use this to power up something that has a very high energy cost. So unfortunately, it's just a little bit too dreamer for Chi-Yu. It doesn't really do either. Both of its attacks aren't really strong enough to build decks around, which is a real shame because it's a very, very cool Pokemon.
Onto Skeledirge EX. It has 340 hit points, which is probably the biggest selling point of this Stage 2 fire type. It has the Vitality Song attack. For 1 fire, you deal 50 and heal 30 from each of your Pokemon. Can be a pretty funny option at offsetting some possible Sableye shenanigans, but 50 damage isn't really enough. And we have the Burning Song attack for 2 fire. You do 270, however, it has that minus text, which means you do 10 less for each damage counter on this Pokemon, which means if you're ever going to make a Skeledirge EX deck work, you have to have some healing in here, otherwise your opponent can sort of punch you first and then suddenly your damage is pitiful. So you can try and make this combination work with Basin and Armor Rouge to try and make it happen, but this is a lot of steps, and none of these cards say draw on them, and neither does Cheryl, so it's way too much work to get going, unfortunately, for Skeledirge.
Next up, we have Clavel EX. This is another Stage 2 320 HP against a water type. So we have the natural benefits of Irida, and realistically, that's one of the selling points of this card: the fact that you can Irida for things like Quackleys or as well as VIP passes or candies and the EX. So yeah, that's pretty nice. But that's one of the biggest selling points. There's two attacks on this Pokemon. It's got Lively Samba for 1 energy that deals 60, and both players switch their active into one of their benched Pokemon. It can be quite disruptive, to be honest. Can force more switching outs out of your opponent. But we've just seen that Jet Energy is a very, very strong card that we'll see play in a variety of archetypes. So decks might naturally have a few more switching cards anyway. You can switch into things like Klefki or Mimikyu, which is pretty interesting. Mimikyu is a safeguarder, which we'll talk about later on, but Klefki obviously has seen some success with the mischievous lock ability that stops these abilities, which is pretty cool. So there's definitely some targets to switch into, but I think realistically these targets aren't all that strong. They're still quite weak. You can still play around boss. You can't play around boss, sorry, so that's not great. There's also Propeller Shot for 2 energy that does 230 damage, and you put 2 energy from this Pokemon back into your hand. I think this is actually quite a nice selling point for this card, to be honest. 2 for 230 is pretty efficient damage. And when you look at the other Stage 2 Quacklevel from the Scarlet and Violet set, Energy Carnival says once during a turn you may attach a basic energy from your hand to one of your Pokemon. So there's obvious natural synergy here, and these cards, again, are both come from the same evolution line, so it's going to be much easier to get them out because you're not going to have to clog your deck up with multiple evolutions, which is really nice. You've got the Irida engine to help build that up, and you've also got a pretty strong attacker in terms of Quacklevel against one prizes, as well as being able to bounce into Klefkis against things like Lost Box and stuff. So it's all pretty cool, but again, very similar to Skeledirge. None of these cards really say draw, so it's going to be difficult to actually get this combo online in the first place. And then as soon as your opponent starts Ionoing you, you put both the energy back into hand, and then they Iono you. You need to find 2 energy again next turn. Things like Irida and Cheryl, again, great when they pay off, but sometimes won't be the supporters you need. They're not going to draw you back into cards, and therefore it all just seems a little bit sort of over complicated here and there. So unfortunately, a really, really cool combination between these two Pokemon, and really cool that they're on the same evolution line, but I think overall not quite going to be good enough, which is a shame.
Onto Bellibolt EX. It's a Stage 1 Lightning type with 280 hit points, not bad for a Stage 1. It has 2 attacks. The first is Jumping Press, doing 50 to one of your opponent's Pokemon. And the second one, kind of the more interesting option here, is the Paralyzing Ball for 2 Lightning and a Colorless. You deal 160. You have to discard 2 Lightning from this Pokemon, and if you do, your opponent's active is now paralyzed. Always have to respect paralysis, especially in an Aiono world, where even if there are switches and jet energies and other outs that your opponent may have, if you hit them with a low hand size, sometimes they miss that out. What I will say is we already have some paralysis options in the format, and I think, well, Luxray does less damage but is easier to get online because it's just a basic and has the upside of Fang Snipe, and Tapu Koko is bigger as sort of a tank if that's the direction that you want to go down, but maybe slightly less reliable than Bellibolt, which does have that painful discard. And unfortunately, Bellibolt's retreat cost is also not helping things here. If you are having to discard these Lightnings all the time, you have to jam-pack your deck with possibly Jet Energy and possibly just a high amount of switching cards, which is sometimes a little bit awkward. So I think it's a little bit outclassed, mostly by that Luxray V.
Next up, we have Slowking EX. This is another Terra EX, which means it takes no damage while it's on the bench, which is a nice little buff to have. 270 HP, Psychic type, Stage 1. First attack is Profound Knowledge, which deals 30 damage and confuses the opponent. Nothing too strong there overall. A nice additional effect, but realistically not overly strong. Wisdom Headbutt for 2, Psychic Energy, deals 130, and you search your deck for up to 2 cards and put them into your hand. So very similar to Togekiss from the past. Togekiss did see a fair bit of play here and there in certain sort of instances, like a quad deck, but I can't see that really happening with Slowking. We've just talked about how strong Aiono is, and every deck's going to be playing it in, well, a lot of decks, most decks are going to be playing it in high counts, so you're very rarely actually going to be able to keep those cards. But it's actually even worse because of Aiono, because you're shuffling the cards to the bottom, so you're not even able to draw back into them, which is really, really unfortunate considering you're typically going to be taking the best 2 cards for the most powerful next turn you can have. I think the biggest selling point is actually the fact that it evolves from Slowpoke, because we already have two Slowbros. They're actually pretty cool. There's the healing one from Scarlet and Violet, and then there's Twilight Inspiration that can just win the game if your opponent's on one prize card. But realistically, this isn't quite going to be strong enough. That the Slowbros aren't enough of a selling point to play this card, especially when most of the time this is just going to be a flat 2 for 130, which is just not strong enough at all.
Onto Annihilate EX. Unfortunately, I didn't get the community rating for this one because we're only getting the full arts of this card and also the Tinkerton EX that we saw earlier in the set. But this is a 320 hit point stage 2 fighting type that has 2 attacks. The first is Angry Grudge. For 1 fighting, you do 20, and you can put up to 12 counters onto Annihilate EX, and you do 20 for each counter that you placed in this way. So you're capping out at 240 for 1 energy. It's actually pretty solid, but of course you are bringing that higher hit point range all the way down to basically being like a basic V Pokemon or something like that, where it's pretty easy to respond on the Annihilate EX. But it could give the deck some early tempo if you do pop off with a rare candy combination, and it does have a 2 energy attack, Seismic Toss, for a fighting and colorless, which just does 150. So if you want to still be that tanky 2-prizer, you have to get a second energy on here, but it is possible to sort of just churn through single prize Pokemon with that Seismic Toss. I initially was just sort of intrigued by this card because the Annihilate EX gives you early tempo from Angry Grudge, and you're not too worried about losing your EX Pokemon because it sort of leads you into that late game where we already have the Rage Fist from the other Annihilate that we have in formats from Scarlet and Violet base, where we're doing a 70x for each prize card your opponent's taken. So Annihilate's been kind of lying in wait for some early pressure, and I think honestly that Angry Grudge isn't that far away. One of the actual frustrations is that Lugia has resistance, so you're not actually as high damage output as you would like to be in one of the sort of bigger matchups that you could be coming up against right now. And ultimately, you are still relying on candy combinations, and you presumably don't want to play too many of the EX because they are only really early game attacking options. You don't want to play too many energy in your deck because they just have 1 and 2 energy attack costs alike, so it's going to be just too convoluted to really get going reliably. It's still too difficult to get rare candy combos for decks that aren't able to utilize the Irida engine, and that's going to be the sort of falling down point of Annihilate. You can see what's going on here. You can see a pretty streamlined option where you split up your Annihilates, maybe like a 2-2 of each, and try and recycle the single prizer as you work towards the late game, but I think it's just going to not really come online reliably enough.
Next up, we have Paldea Clodsire EX. This is a 280 HP Dark type that has the Toxic Wetland ability. Once during a turn, if a stadium is in play, you may make the opponent's active Pokemon poison. So this, in combination with Radiant Hisuian Sneasler, can be an additional 30 damage, which is pretty much exactly Hypnotoxic Laser and Verbank from back in the day, which is a very, very strong sort of combination of cards. Admittedly, this was at a time where HP was much lower, so that was actually like a 1/6 of a Pokemon's HP, whereas now it's like a 9th, maybe even a 10th. And whilst that doesn't sound massively different, it's actually pretty impactful. It's then got the Needle Bone attack, which does 200 damage for a Dark and 2 colorless, and says flip a coin if tails. During the next turn, this Pokemon can't attack. So 200, realistically, you're probably going to be wanting to use this with double turbo, so that's down to 180. With the Toxic Wetland and Poison Peak combination, that's up to 210. So that's why I've got a Lesson Studio on here to 1, fulfill that Toxic Wetland sort of condition, but 2, push you up to 220, which means you're dealing with various 2-prize EX Pokemon and V Pokemon here and there. Realistically, it's just so much payoff. So much work for not much payoff, so much work for just 220 damage. Really not that impressive, but this is the best we could do in terms of finding a combination of a way to play this Pokemon. Being able to reach a relevant number being able to reach 220 is the best way we can think of, because that's actually a relevant number. Realistically, there's not masses more that you can do with this card.
Onto some purely bulk Vs then. Dedenne is a terror, so it can't be hit on the bench, but there really isn't much reason to enjoy its attacks. Pikachu is completely outclassed by Miraidon EX in every way, and Lycanroc EX also has essentially no selling points, and Fighting type isn't really supported right now outside of probably just Tingloo archetypes.
Yeah, and this is our EX Pokemon summary. So once again, feel free to pause here to take a look at a quick summary of how we've rated everything before we jump into the one prizes.
So first of all, we have Luxray then, a card that I'm really hyped by. I'm a big fan of this card. Its Vibrant Flash ability is a big reason for that. Once during a turn, if this Pokemon is in your hand and you have more prize cards remaining than your opponent, you may play this Pokemon directly onto your bench. So you have to treat this as essentially a basic Pokemon. You're not going to be seeing Luxios, you're not going to be seeing Shinx. We're just going to be putting Luxrays into our decks so that we can immediately bench this when we are behind. That Wild Charge attack dealing 180 and doing 20 damage to yourself seems very powerful to me. I think this is going to go into a number of Lugia decks, but it's also a counter to Lugia in many ways, which is quite an interesting dynamic to have here, where Lugia gains access to another pretty solid single prize attacking option, which I think is great. And lightning typing is, of course, good into the Lugia mirror, but also could be handy into Palkia V-Star if it's showing up in Chien Pao decks or just decks of its own. So I do think there's real reason to have this combination. Reverse Energy can be tutored immediately if you are playing Archeops, so it's such an easy combination. We know there's a ton of ball searching already in Lugia with your stadiums as well as your capturing aromas, so you should have pretty decent access to Luxray as and when you want it to try and skew that prize race especially and give you some comeback potential in that mirror, which I think is pretty huge. I also think, as we know, Gardevoir is a great user of reversal energy, so if it wants to go higher on the reversal count and maybe add in a Luxray to its deck list, you could then have that decent type coverage at your disposal. And possibly even Lost Zone decks could look towards this Luxray. Even if you're not playing Reversal Energy in your deck, you could just think about getting to 7 as Mirage Gate, almost as like an alternative to having Thumping Snorlax in some of these Lost Box variants, with the upside being you have better type coverage into Lugia, so it's a far stronger tech card. But also thinking about how the matchups normally play out, where you are up against multi-prizes like Arceus, etc., you can get that early tempo poke in with Cram, then you go down a prize as they knock out your Cramorant, and then suddenly Luxray's online. I think it is slightly less searchable than Snorlax, but possibly it's worth the downside because of that type coverage at its disposal. So I think it's pretty much guaranteed in Lugia, and is potentially finding its way into Guardi and potentially, outclassing the likes of Raikou Skyseal Stone that we've seen from a number of these Lost Zone box players, because I do think a lot of Lost Zone's issues right now are how proactively you can deal with Lugia, and this may end up being like a less combo-y way to actually get into the game against them and have some real bounce back, so I'm a big fan of this card.
Next up, we have Spiritomb with the Pitch Black Disaster ability. As long as this Pokemon is in play, basic Pokemon V in play, both yours and your opponents have no abilities. So this is a very, very strong ability. Naturally, first port of call is stopping things like Genesect and that Fusion Strike system. Now, bear in mind, you can get around this with Fusion Energy. But this is a huge one-card include, and whilst we've seen various one-card includes that quote-unquote should end Mew's sort of reign over the format, none of them have actually done it yet. I think this is actually probably the most splashable one, though, because it's not a two-prizer, it can just sit on the bench. This kind of effect will be really strong or stronger and stronger sort of as we go forward and we get more it'll be weaker as we go forward when we get more good EXs, but also there'll be more decks that this doesn't hurt, so there's no real downside. It's only a one-sided effect, even though this is a mirrored effect. So it's a card that's has a very, very strong ability, and this might actually be finally a nail in Mew's coffin, and it might actually stop the deck being quite as powerful as it is. This in combination with things like Aiono and stuff, when they're down to a low hand size, low amount of prizes, can put them down to a low hand size and maybe really force them to struggle to find their last KO, which is pretty interesting. Also stops Weirdeer, which has not really seen any play so far, but we'll see a fair amount of play going forward in that new Lugia archetype that we mentioned. As it's a really, really strong attacker in the late game. Interestingly for Spiritomb, it also works as a positive for you because you can use Slacking V's kind of lazy, or you can turn off Slacking V's kind of lazy ability and start using Heavy Impact for 260 for 4. So there is some other cool uses, but in general, I think this is being seen as a big anti-Mew card with additional benefit of countering things like Weirder as well. And I think that's basically going to be what it's used as overall. It also has the fade out attack as well, just to be put back into the hand if ever you need to turn on your abilities again. during the next turn, which is quite funny. But yeah, in general, this is going to be a really, really strong or really, really nice inclusion, splashable inclusion for any deck that struggles to deal with Mew. And there'll be certain situations where even this is even stronger than something like a Drapion, which we've seen see very, very huge amounts of success. Sometimes Spiritomb might even outclass that, and in terms of being a Mew counter, which is really interesting to see.
Onto the Wings of Union archetype that we're getting all the cards for in this set. So the three birds that you can see on the screen, the Murkrow, the Wattrel, and the Flamigo, all have this Wings of Union attack. The Wattrel and Flamigo deal this attack for 2 colorless energy, and the Murkrow requires darkness energy. And it's all dealing 20 times the amount of Pokemon in your discard pile that has the Wings of Union attack. So the pretty simple idea is to be binning these off as you go and trying to deal as much damage as possible. It has throwbacks to Night March, Lost March, all these other things out there. And we actually have some pretty good type coverage this time around. Murkrow being a dark type means it can be quite threatening into Mew players and into Gardevoir players, which I think is pretty interesting. And Wattrel, being a lightning type, has pretty favourable typing into Lugia, which means it takes a lot less Pokemon to fuel your discard pile to be reaching dangerous numbers, which I think is pretty important. We also have Ditto with that sudden transformation to effectively act as additional copies here, so we could potentially put all of our Wings of Union Pokemon into the discard pile and still continue to launch attacks with this Ditto. We do have Rescue Carry as well to recover these Pokemon, so again, if you want to maximize your damage output, knowing that you can get back these Pokemon later can be pretty handy. Flamigo also has some minor upside of putting it into play, because when you put this Pokemon from your hand onto your bench, you can search your deck for up to 3 Flamigo and put them directly into your hand, then shuffle your deck, which means then, you know, you can use Squawkabilly's Show Off to just pitch them all straight away and thin your deck of these Pokemon. You could use Research, you could use Curlier, you can use all this stuff. So directly thinning the deck of these Pokemon, making it far less of a brick is fantastic. We know that we could end up attacking with this Flamigo or just using like Collapse Stadium to remove it from play later on, which could be great. So the idea of this is literally just pitch everything as quickly as possible. This deck is certainly going to be limited as a one-prize deck because Lost Zone exists and everything has low hit points, and that's pretty awkward for you. They can get some easy uptrades and multi-prize turns against you. And also we have some awkward energy attack costs in here as well. We're likely going to be playing Quad Double Turbo and Quad Luminous, so that we can attack with Murkrow, but also have the Radiant Charizard option available to us as well, which can have some higher damage output later on. So I think the damage output isn't necessarily the issue here. I just think like the speed at which you get towards that damage is the bigger headache for you. And also it is going to be the secondary single prizer in format, because it always has to respect that Lost Box is just sort of quicker out the gate, more consistent, and has better ways of taking multi-prize turns against you, which is going to be the big headache for this sort of approach. But a nice throwback to archetypes that many of us have seen in the past in different iterations.
Next up, we have Mimikyu. Mimikyu is a card that we've already mentioned. Is a 70 HP psychic type that has the Safeguard ability. Ability we're very, very familiar with, most recently on Miltank, which actually both Joe and I have played very recently, and that's pretty much what's meriting it this 2-star. We've actually played this card recently for a number of reasons, and we played Miltank recently for a number of reasons. And similarly, we can see Mimikyu fitting into that slot because it's a strict upgrade on Miracle Body, since it also protects itself from EX Pokemon as well. It's got less HP, which is a bit awkward, but it's still serving that safeguard purpose and forcing the opponent to have some kind of wall breaking effect. Maybe this is going to be a new bit part player in control archetypes, but also it has a relatively cool attack. Ghostly Eyes for 2 energy, put 7 damage counters on your opponent's active Pokemon. So things like Gardevoir can naturally play it and force another layer of sort of complexity to opponents that are trying to deal with Gardevoir. But also we played Miltank in Sablezard, which was, it was a really, really strong card in that. And that deck naturally plays Psychic Energy anyway, so it seems like a relatively cool upgrade in that deck as well. So yeah, just worth noting that there's definitely some upside to this over Miltank, especially in a couple of archetypes in particular.
Onto Oricorio. It's a 90 hit point basic fire type with the Passionate Dance ability, which is what we're taking a look at here. Once during your turn, you may heal 20 from your active evolution Pokemon. So the entire idea here is that we're going to be filling our board with these, ideally, so that we can spam heal some stuff. This could be an extra way of getting an extra energy onto a Gardevoir, but it takes up a space in your deck and on the board, so I don't think it's going to be worthwhile when we could just be playing Champs Fest instead. I think if ever there's a home, it could be a tanky Copperage deck where we have multiple Oricorio, reminding me of like Celosaur when it had multiple Shaman in the deck, just as those little healing options. But I think it's, not all that fast, takes up board space, and we have other decent ways of healing right now in the game, so I don't think it's going to be that high value.
Next up, we have Miss Magius. This is another 1-star card, unfortunately. Stage 1, 90 HP, Psychic type, with a Magical Flick ability. When you play this card from your hand to evolve one of your Pokemon during a turn, you may choose an energy attached to your opponent's active Pokemon and move it to one of their benched Pokemon. So you can sort of see this as like a heads-on a crushing hammer, because you can put it on a target that naturally isn't going to be using the energy. Or you can spread out some energy. Maybe your opponent has a couple of special energy attached, maybe against a Lugia or something. So you can flick one off to one of the bench Pokemon and then Giacomo and discard 2 at once. Realistically, these are very, very niche effects, and it's not worth putting a stage 1 into your deck to do this. But definitely worth noting that this could see some play here and there, maybe down the line, if there's ways of being, or if there's better controlling archetypes and that kind of thing. It's more of a nod to that than anything else.
Onto Gothitelle, another nod towards some controlling stuff, as its Star Reading ability allows you once during a turn to look at the top 2 cards of your opponent's deck, choosing one of them, putting it to the top and the other to the bottom of their deck. So you're trying to force bad draws on your opponent, essentially, is the idea here. It actually also has an attack which synergizes with this. The Psych Out for Psychic and Colorless does 120 and discards a random card from the opponent's hand. I think if ever there's going to be some sort of like hand lock approach, it will rely on this Gothitelle right now. You can try and Iono your opponent to that low hand size, go for a Star Reading, make sure they're bricking off that, and then discarding other resources from the hand. That's why I've got Mimikyu on the screen as well. It just has that Max Shadow, which discards a random card from the opponent's hand. Not sure if there are many better sort of discard from hand options, possibly like Luxray and stuff as well. But I think it's hard to justify handlock when we are already so cautious of Iono that there's going to be barrels, there's going to be Curliers, there's going to be lots of other onboard answers to hand control, so people can naturally top up, which makes life quite difficult for a Gothitelle, I think.
Next up, we have Wigglytuff, one that we've already mentioned, 110 HP Psychic type with the Balloon Therapy ability. That's you once during a turn, you may search your deck for a Therapy energy and attach it to one of your Pokemon. So as Joe mentioned, this is basically like a quarter of an Archeops. Unfortunately, this is even slightly worse than that, because it only targets specific energy, which is a real pain. So as soon as these energy are discarded or anything like that, you're going to need to find ways of shuffling them back in with things like Silene. I think the biggest combinations we've already seen, or the best combination we've already seen, is Snorlax. But the other one that you can kind of think of is Regigigas, which lets you... the difficulty with Regigigas has always been sort of finding a way to attach 3 energy quite efficiently to be able to start setting off Giga Impacts quite quickly. This way, you can hopefully do that a little bit more effectively and then start looping Sharon's Care. Again, realistically, it's not going to be a particularly strong archetype, but these are sort of the best 2 applications of this energy acceleration that we can find.
Onto Garganacl. It's a stage 2 fighting type with 180 hit points. It has the Blessed Salt ability. During Pokemon Checkup, heal 20 from each of your Pokemon, so it's twice as effective as an Elegant Heal. And that's kind of the idea here. So if you are really looking for some walling, tanking, passing style archetypes, having Garganacl at your disposal could be handy, but this is a stage 2 Pokemon and it's hard to get working reliably, so that's why we're giving it the low rating.
Next up, we have Glimmora, 130 HP stage 1. Has the Crystal Break ability. When this Pokemon is knocked out, flip a coin. If head, your opponent can't take any prizes for it. This is a pretty interesting ability, but unfortunately the attack isn't strong enough to actually justify playing a deck around this. Psych Out basically just deals, give your opponent the poison status, but then ups it to 6 counters. So it's essentially 60 damage. It's essentially 120 damage coming back into your turn. So 1 for 120 is pretty interesting, but there's plenty of switch outs right now. that are going to mean they're going to be getting out of this, and 50% of the time you're still going to be giving up a prize. I'm pretty sure even if you flip on average or slightly above average amounts of heads, you're still going to be losing a lot of prize cards or losing the race a lot of the time because Psych Out just doesn't do enough damage, especially when you can also just sort of be opponents can just deal bench damage or anything like that as well. So unfortunately, just not quite strong enough attack to make Crystal Break worth playing.
Onto Graphite Eye. It's a pretty interesting dark type 90 hit point stage 1. We're looking at its colourful graffiti attack here. For 1 dark, you deal 40 times the number of basic energy you discard from your hand. So this is very relatable to Fireball Circus from Blacephalon, or possibly even Rapid Strike Tentacles from Malamar, so of course I'm going to give it a second look. It's 90 hit points and it's dark. Those are 2 big upsides here. So we have good search, we have good recovery from Rescue Carrier, and that dark typing is helpful for making it very easy for you to reach on Mew VMAX and Gardevoir players at the very least. And we have Eldegoss currently in format, another sub 90 hit point Pokemon, so you can see how we can try and use some drawing supporter cards or engine Pokemon and then end on the likes of Energy Retrieval or Eldegoss to pull multiple energy out to try and reach higher damage output thresholds. So that's the combination. It's going to be a lot of setup. It's more low hit point Pokemon. So again, like I was saying with Wings of Union, it's going to play second fiddle at best to Lost Zone Box, just because everything is so squishy and vulnerable, and you have to constantly recycle these Pokemon. So it's not really going to get a look in, but it's definitely going to be a fun meme deck that I try out on the ladder.
Next up, we have Hydreigon, stage 2, 180 HP dark type, with the Tri-Howl ability that says during your turn, you may look at the top 3 cards of the deck and attach any number of energy cards you find there to your Pokemon in any way you like, then you discard the other cards. Realistically, we have better ways of doing this. We have Gardevoir, which only looks at the top 2, but you get to keep the cards. And also serves as a much better attacker and has a much better stage 1 in Curlier. So realistically, it's just completely outclassed by Gardevoir, which is a shame because it's not you get to see 1 more card, but the discard the other cards is so painful that it's not worth trying to build around.
Onto Weavile. It has the Hunt Assault ability, which is why it's worth noting at the very least. Once during your turn, when this Pokemon moves from your bench to your active, you may switch one of your opponent's benched basic Pokemon to the active spot. It's quite limited, and you can't just start your turn with Weavile in the active and retreat. You have to get it in and then back out, so you have to be using the likes of Jet Energy attachments onto Weavile, or switch into it, then find a switch back out of it or retreat out of it, that sort of thing. So pretty awkward, and it's only targeting basics, which makes it too limited right now.
Next up, we have Orthworm, a basic 130 HP metal type with the Nutritional Ion ability. It says if this Pokemon has 3 or more metal energy attached, it gets 100 plus 100 HP. So that takes it up to 230, which on a 1 prizer is actually pretty bulky. Unfortunately, its attack costs 4 energy. So whilst that synergizes with the Nutritional Ion ability, it means it's actually not doing anything until it's got that amount of energy anyway. It does 100 damage and 30 to one of your opponent's bench Pokemon, so even for 4 energy, that's just not a strong enough attack. There's not great ways to be able to attach energy to this thing either. It's basically just Magnezone. So unfortunately, this card is pretty much outclassed almost entirely by Zamazenta. You could maybe look at playing like a Metal Box style deck, but realistically, I think Zamazenta is better in almost every way. Even though it's less tanky, it's got a much better attack, and it's 1 less energy, and even just Metal Shield can provide enough defense compared to Nutritional Iron. So yeah, it's unfortunately outclassed. Maybe you can try and build a Metal Box, but I think realistically, it's not quite good enough.
Onto Dudunsparce. It's a stage 1 colourless type, 140 hit points. We're looking at that second attack here, Digging Flash, that deals 100 and auto paralyzes, and then you shuffle this Pokemon and all cards attached back into your deck. It's a very hefty attack cost with 4 colourless, but go with me here. If you're choosing to put a Dunsparce in your Lugia decks because you're worried about lightning types, especially the likes of Luxray coming out in the next set, it's not too much of a push to add a Duduns in your deck to then give you a panic play option where you go Iono, Paralyze, hope to buy a turn here or there and finish things off on the following turn. Now, I think it's too much space to make work, but Dunsparce could still be a good enough tech card on its own. So I think it's probably just not going to be worthwhile and too unreliable and too much of a dead card in multiple situations. And then once in the blue moon, that paralysis gets you out of a bad spot. But I just don't think that's a card worth playing in Lugia, which already sort of walks that tightrope of consistency and wants as many slots as possible to its ball search. So that's the main limiting factor here.
Next up, we have Pelipper. Pelipper is a 120 HP Stage 1 Pokemon with the Rumour on the Wind ability, which I think has been translated to Hearsay, which is such a shame because it's a great ability name. When you play this Pokemon from your hand to evolve one of your Pokemon during your turn, you may either search your deck for a supporter card or search your discard pile for a supporter card and put it into your hand. So very, very flexible effect, which is really, really cool. I really like the effect, but unfortunately, once again, it's just outclassed by cards we already have. Gallade might be a Stage 2, but it's a Stage 2 of a good evolution line anyway. Powpad is naturally played in Gardevoir as well. So whilst these are very specific cards to Gardevoir at the moment, I don't think we're too far away from Curlier and Gardevoir engines and even Gallade engines being part of multiple other decks. We've already seen it in some iterations of decks anyway. So unfortunately, whilst things like Gallade is a Stage 2, I think realistically, the whole package that you get from playing Gallade is just better than it outclasses the fact that Pelipper is a Stage 1, which is a shame because it would be nice to see a bit of flexibility. But yeah, I think the Gallade line is just so much more flexible overall, even though it is a Stage 2 in comparison.
And that wraps things up then. Here are the ratings for the single prize Pokemon, and that's it for the set review. These are some of my favourites, alt art. So I'm really excited for this set. We've talked about a lot of very, very playable cards. We've got Chien Pao Baxcalibur, which is going to hit the ground running, I imagine, as a pretty high tempo attacking deck that has both one hit KO potential and some cheeky sniping potential from single prize Pokemon. So I really expect it to be in that mix for one of the top decks in format. I think Gardevoir is another big winner from this set, just inherently. It can very easily use some of the best cards we're getting from the sets in Reversal Energy and Aiono. And I think just in general, being in an Aiono world, like Jack was saying, completely changes the landscape of what decks are viable. Every deck is going to have game plans for going down to low hand sizes, and everyone knows that if they have a kind of crummy start, as long as they can claw back into the game, they can sometimes buy turns and get back from dire positions thanks to that card in format. So I feel like it's going to be a real breath of fresh air to be playing in this new format. I think we're actually in a really good format right now, but I think the introductions from Paldea Evolved are going to make the game even more fun, even more ingenuitive for players, and it's going to feel like there's going to be much more agency over how games develop, I think.
Yeah, it looks like a really, really interesting set, and I actually think there's something for everyone in the set as well. There's some great fun 1 prizes, there's some great fun 2 prizes, but there's also a fan favorite archetype back and some fan favorite cards. So yeah, I think this is a really, really cool set. I'm very excited to see how things play out, and obviously we've got NAIC with this set, and we're going to be playing Worlds and the Yokohama Open, which we're assuming we're going to have, and stuff like that with this set as well. So there's going to be some pretty big tournaments that are sort of affected by this set. So yeah, really looking forward to seeing how this set changes things up.
Thanks so much for watching then. We're right into it with Paldea Evolved content from now on as well. There are still tournaments in the current Scarlet and Violet meta, which we'll be keeping you up to date on, but we are turning our attention now to the upcoming set. Hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you tomorrow for another video. Cheers.